Hello guys, I hope this is Harish Kulkarni and I hope you guys have already watched my previous video on arrays. So today we are going to learn a concept called exceptions. What are exceptions in Java, right? So an exception in Java is an event that interrupts the normal flow of a program. Okay, it is an object that gets created when an error occurs at runtime. Okay, in Java, all exceptions are observed or objects are derived from the it- a class called throwable. So there is one some hierarchy here. So if you check some hierarchy, okay, so there are some hierarchies if you check it. So a parent class of throwable, right? Throwable is the parent class. Fine. So once So in Java by default, there is a super class called object. Okay. So just before throwable, there is a class called object. Okay. So object, this throwable class will extend the object class. That is by default, even if you extend this or not. For example, whatever the classes which we have written earlier, right? Okay. By default, this addition also extends the class called objects. That is the reason why, okay, if you are trying to override, right, if you check, and I'll show you what I mean to say. So I'll just try to so there are some methods inside the object class. Okay, those are hash code, clone. Okay, so by default, even if you don't mention it, okay, it provides the concept of inheritance by using a base class called object. Okay, so then you have a class called throwable. Okay, and then this throwable exception is a class which is extending throwable class. Error is a class which is extending throwable. Okay, under the exception there are two types of exceptions, that is compile time exception and runtime exception. Okay, so the examples of the compile time exception are the IO exception, SQL exception, class not found exception. And the example of the runtime exception are like you have getting arithmetic expression. For example, you're doing some arithmetic operation and some exception happens, right? So then you get arithmetic exception. So for example, you're trying to access a variable which is null, right? At that point of time you will get a exception called null pointer exception. And then whenever you're trying to format some variables, right? So then you get number format exception. And you're trying to access a uh, index, okay, which is not existing, then you get index out of bound exception, around which we get array and string out of bound exception, right? So on the other side we have something called error. So under the error you get might out of memory error. Okay, sometimes you get, this is the most common thing which you get, out of memory error. Okay, in Java whenever your space is not available you get out of memory error. Okay, and then stack overflow error, right? So what happens is, that's what, so here that's what I explained here. Object is a place class, and then you have something called throwable, which has been error and exception, and a runtime and compile time exception. So what is an error? It's a serious issue not meant to be handled, which is caused by a JVM. Examples of out of memory and stack overflow, that's what we saw, right? So exception can be handled by application. So there are two types of application, right? As I told, one is checked exception, that is checked at compile time. Okay, the example is file not found exception, IO exception, XQL exception, class, sorry for that, class not found exception, right? You must either, what you should do is either you have to handle it using by try catch, or you can handle it using the throws keyword. Fine. And there is another exception called unchecked exception, that is checked at runtime, right? So runtime exceptions are null pointer, array index out of bound exception, illegal argument exception, arithmetic exception. So whether checked exception is checked at the compile time, yes. So unchecked is not checked at compile time. Must handle or declare, yes. This cannot be handled. Subclass is exception. A subclass is the runtime exception. Example is IO exception. Here example is the null pointer exception. It is used for recoverable conditions. This is used for the programming errors. Okay, let's check an example of both the compile time as well as the uh, runtime exception. So before going there, so what is an exception in detail? I mean, it's just a general word. Okay, general example. So exception is an unexpected event that occurs during the execution of a program, right? So for example, you have a pizza delivery analogy, the best way to explain. Okay, so a normal flow, how it happens: a driver picks the pizza and delivers it to a destination, right? What is the exception? The driver finds the main bridge is closed. Then can he deliver it to the destination? No, right? How can you handle it? If the driver has a backup plan, like if he has GPS, he can take a different bridge, right? So if they have no plan, they sit there forever and the customer never gets the pizza. The program crashes, right? So just like you have to handle your program to come out of that particular exception or error. Okay, so there are some terminologies inside this exception, right? So there is something called try, catch, finally, throw, and throws. Okay, so what is try? So whatever the code which you think you'll get an exception, that you actually write inside the try block. Okay, code that throws the exception. Okay, that might you think it throws exception, right? So then you provide in this. Catch is, so if exception happens, what you should do, whether you must retry. So you get some exception, right? You might try, or you might, so for example, from the, so you are trying to access some site. Okay, you are trying to access some site. What happens in the real time scenario is maybe some point of time some database is down, or the file which you're trying to access is down, okay, or it is not available. So then it might throw an exception, right? So at that point of time, whether it, if it shows you some unwanted error or something on the UI which is not expected, right? So then you must you must handle that situation, right? For that case, you use catch block to handle the exception. So finally is the key, I mean, it's a keyword or it's a block, okay, which will be executed always, whether an exception is thrown or not. Okay, so this is the default. So throw is a keyword which we use to throw the exception. Okay, so I mean, if you want to throw some custom exception, right? So then we use the row throw keyword. Okay, and throws is nothing but, so either you have to provide try and catch, or you have to use a throws keyword to handle that exceptions. So we'll see in a bottom with an example. Okay, now I'm just going through that. Okay, so example of the checked exceptions, as I told you: file not found exception, SQL exception, whether you're trying to communicate to a database. Okay, so when you connect to a database, that database is down, server is down, so then that is exceptional SQL exception. So file not found exception is, now you're trying to read a file and you're trying to process something, but the file which you're trying to read, if in real time or when you're trying to run, if that file does not exist, what should the system behave? You're trying to read context, but when the user has deleted a file, how the system should behave. Okay, so IO exception: a network failure occurs, right, while downloading a file. Okay, or class not found exception: you're trying to download a driver. Okay, driver is nothing but, it's not like our lorry driver, right? So inside the, if you're going to connect to any database, right, you need to define some drivers. Okay, so that driver, okay, you try to load a driver, but the jar file is missing. Okay, then you get class not found exception. So now let's check example of this actually checked exception. Okay, so for example, you just picked up this code. Okay, what are you trying to do here? What are we trying to do is, we're trying to access a file. Okay, file, uh, file, 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 checked exception. Public static void main string, and you're trying to provide that. Okay. So what are you trying to do here? So now you're trying to read this line triggers a checked exception. So you're trying to read a file mydata.txt from some location. So at that point of time, so if you execute this file, it will throw, do we have this mydata.txt in some location? If it does not exist, okay, it will give an error called system.out.println alert the file is missing from the folder. If you check it, so it is trying to upload those. Let's upload that. Wait 1 second. So there is one more concept called package. Okay, so this file reader is being defined in some default package. So if you hover over that, it will give you that class name. If I hover over that, okay, inside import class, I'm just trying to import class. Okay, so it will try to import on the top from which package is this been imported. Okay, so this is the package java.io package. This is a default package which it's a java.io package where the file reader class exists. Okay, file not found exception also it exists in the exception class. So it will try to import that. Will try to import that class. This is provided in the exception fold exception package. So it will try to import that exception there. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to read the file mydata.txt. If this file exists, we will proceed. Otherwise, it will throw an exception. Okay. So basically it got stuck. Give it a couple of minutes. Still why this is showing an error. It's taking some time. Okay, now it has been, the error has been gone. Okay, now if you try to run this, so what happens is you just add a debug point here. Okay, so whenever are we getting an error here? Okay, there is an extra bracket. So you're trying to read a file, but this file does not exist, mydata.txt. Okay, if this file does not exist, what what it will throw, it will throw an exception called file not found exception, right? So how the system should behave, what you should do if you get some exception in the catch block, whether you might throw some custom thing or some message saying this message, they're saying this file does not exist, such type of things which will provide here. Okay, so that's what, if this file does not exist, it will throw a file not found exception. Similarly, if you're connecting to a database, okay, so when you're trying connecting to a database, okay, so you might have to handle it using SQL exception, right? Either that server might go down, or the query which you have written might be wrong, okay, to connect to the to fetch the details from the database, right? So those things will happen, right? So you're trying to read this file, okay, what happens if that file does not exist? It will throw exception. So it will throw that exception, file not found exception. Okay, and you try to perform there, right? If this file does not exist, sir, you might ask some question. Sir, you're giving a file which is does not exist, right? You're only giving it and you're trying to throw an exception. But in the real world, in the real time, what happens is you're trying to work in a real world example, right? So you might, this file might be you're trying to upload it from the UI, okay? And from the other location server or some other service, you're trying to read this uploaded file, okay? But in the meanwhile, okay, if this file is deleted by other user and you're trying to access that file, what happens? You should handle that. I mean, the program or the code which you have written, it should handle it, right? For that case, we have a concept of exception. This you can either handle in this way, or the other way is, okay, you can actually do, what you can do is, if you don't want this class to handle this, so if you check hover over this, what it will give an error saying either you uh, I mean, surround this code with the try catch, or use that throws keyword, throws file not found exception. So if I just provide this error, the error is gone. So either you have to surround this code with the try catch, or you just say throws file not found exception. Until, so what is the compile time exception? Until you write that code, your code will won't compile, right? So I mean, how the system should behave. You're trying to read a file. If system, this file is not existing, how the system should behave. That is a compile time exception, right? Now you're trying to connect to a database, okay, and if the database is down, so then you get SQL exception. Okay, what you do? You write one more code. Okay, I'll try to show you what. There's multi-catch. So I'll just say Control Z. So what I will do is I'll just copy this exception again, okay, and I paste here, and I say here, this is multiple catch blocks, right? I say SQL exception. Okay, so when you're trying to connect to a database, and if that server is down or something, right, in that case you try to handle the compile exception. So you try to import that, this is existing compile time exception, right? So java.sql exception, you try to import it. Okay, so what is compile time exception? A exception which will be handled at the time of compile time, that is compile time exception. The best examples are file not found exception or SQL exception. That you have to, actually the code which is trying to throw an exception, you write it in the try block, or then if once that exception is thrown, okay, how do you handle that error is you surround it using the catch block, right? Now there is one more thing which we have to learn, right? That is finally block, right? So this finally block is that block which will be executed whether it will go inside this cache block or not. This finally will execute always. Okay. So if I say, so if I say this is finally block, finally block. Okay. I'll just try to remove this. This is trying. So otherwise we'll import that exception. Import java.sql dot SQL exception. Okay, so this compiler error will be gone. Okay, what it says here, that is not reachable, but we might have not provided that code, exact code of what to connect or something. That's why this error is there. Okay, will but this is how you write multiple catch blocks error. Okay, so what I will do is I'll try to show you this execution. So if I just compile this, or if I just run this, so it will, what it do, it will first try to read this. Okay, and it will go inside this catch block, and then finally block will be executed. So you see this file has been missed. So whether it goes inside catch block or not, finally will be executed always. Okay, so this is the compile time exception. Okay, now let's go to the what is runtime exception, right? Let's check one more example, that is runtime exception. So runtime exceptions, the best example of runtime exception is arithmetic exception, right? Runtime exception. So if I just run this main, right? So so you have a variable, okay, int a equals to 10 by 0. What will happen in this scenario? If you a number which is divisible by 0, what will happen? If I just run this, right? Okay, this, what does it say? Okay, 20 inside KTK. Okay, it has actually created something called uh, Kotlin. Let's delete this and create a newer one. So you're trying to, okay, static name string, say int a equals to 10 by 0. Okay, now you're trying to print s out. Okay, if I say s out, and you try to check the values, right? Okay, so you're trying to print ea. Okay, so what will happen? So in this case, okay, there is some space here. Okay, okay, so if I just give, if you check that there is some space, right? If so, that execution, I mean, that execution is not enabled. So if I just run this, what is happening? It will give an exception called arithmetic exception, because You're trying to divide by 0, okay, and the value does not exist. So it will say this is a runtime exception, a value which will be, or a exception which is occurred at the runtime. It's not at the compile time, right? What is my compile time? It checks for the error, all those things. So if it is throwing at the time of compile time, that is compile time exception. On the runtime, this exception is thrown, right? That's why. So this is called as runtime exception. Okay, there are other exceptions also. I'll show you one. Once this is done, I'll show you the other ones. That is, so for example, you are having string. So if you check, it has given arithmetic exception, division by 0. Okay, so you say string s equals to null. Okay, and you're trying to access, yes, yes dot, I'll say one thing, s dot, one second, s dot, okay, front inside here. You're trying to compare this string with the Java. Okay, just let's check that. Okay, you're trying to, s equals is method of string which you're trying to compare with Java, but string, the value yes is holding to a variable called null, and now you're trying to say yes dot equals of Java. Okay, now if you try to compile this, what exception you are accepting, I mean expecting, it is null pointer exception, because on s is already holding null. Okay, and on top of that we are trying to run some string methods like equals or the other, right? So if you check this, it will give something called null pointer exception. The best examples of the runtime exception are the I mean arithmetic exception or the null pointer exception. Okay, so that is another exception. Fine, and there is so if you are trying to, if you want to handle this, right, so you can handle this also. What generally it's the standard is that, so whenever, so if you check, so it's still giving arithmetic exception. Why did it not compile properly? So generally, runtime exceptions are the exceptions which occur at the runtime. Compile time are the compile time exceptions. So what is the example of compile time? That is file not found exception or SQL exception. What is the examples of runtime exception? Runtime exception examples are arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. Okay, this is the uh, this what do you call, an example of the runtime exception. Okay, now on these are the defined predefined, right? These are the predefined exceptions, right? So apart from that, there is something called user defined exception. It means that now, for example, you're trying to access, you have an ATM. Okay, you have an ATM and you're trying to, your account balance is 0. Okay, now when your account balance is 0 and you're trying to uh, you went to ATM card and trying to withdraw the money from the ATM card. Okay, now then what should happen? It should say that, it should show some exception, right? So amount not found exception or amount 0 exception, or in such way, right? At that point of time you use something called uh, we actually use something called use a defined exception. I'll show you the example what I'm trying to say. So what you should do first is you should define this insufficient funds exception, okay, which you have to extend this insufficient funds exception. Okay, so for just to save the time, right, I've already written the code here. Okay, so what are we trying to do? So this is the custom logic, so which will actually extend the uh, exception class. Okay, so what do you need to do now? This, it is already extending extending exception class. So what message you want to throw? you're trying to call the message. Okay.